guys, and welcome back to another video. I thought it'd be pretty insightful to show you guys all of the essay questions that I had, the exam questions that I had, and also what I wrote for them, like what I actually argued for them. Obviously, this video is probably going to be a bit long, but I'm going to try and explain my arguments as succinctly as possible for anybody that's interested in either medical law or medical ethics, because that's what I did my master's in. So this is pretty much everything that I have done coursework-wise and exam-wise this year, which ran from 2020 to 2021. So let's jump right into it. I'm going to do them in chronological order, and I've written my notes down in a little book. So I'm going to explain the module that it was for, kind of put the question on screen, and then give you a summary of the argument. So the first essay I did was for my moral theory module. That was a compulsory module. It was part of the first term teaching that I had for my master's, and basically it just generally looked at the most basic like moral theory arguments and ethical arguments and applying those to the medical setting. So the essay question that I chose, I'll put it here, but essentially it was asking, do dead people have rights? Now, I found this a really interesting question, and I argued that they don't have rights, because initially when I read the question I was like, they must have rights. And then when I looked into the literature I was like, yeah, they don't. So essentially what I argued for that, and it's stretching my memory because I submitted this in December, is saying that the author Feinberg, which is detailed in the question there, he basically argues that it's obvious that when we're alive that we have rights, and then they basically transcend for when you die. I don't agree with that. I think personally the rights that we have just cease when we die, and effectively once we're dead, it's a dead body. That dead body doesn't have any right, but it is a moral practice for why we conduct funerals and why we follow somebody's wishes. We follow somebody's wishes not because they have a right to have that wish carried out, but because we feel a moral duty to carry that wish out. That's essentially what I tried to argue. And Feinberg's article is like, oh my god, so lengthy, and he jumps around and tries and argues like retrospective rights and stuff like that, and it's a pain in the arse to read if you ever fancy reading it. But basically, yeah, the summary is that I said dead people don't have rights because they're dead, and you only can have rights when you're alive in order to exercise them. But dead people do have the respect of people that are alive, and it's the alive people that carry the wishes for the dead. The second piece I submitted was a 1,500 word exam paper with a 24-hour exam for my ethics module. This was a optional module that I took, and basically the tutor for this, he was one of my favourites for the year. He like did his studying at Harvard, and he was just proper on it and super smart and delivered the teaching in such a fun way. So big up to you, Jonathan. But essentially the class syllabus spanned from Aristotle and Socrates to modern day ethics, and it basically went through all of the ethics kind of theories you can think of. And then this module, I'm pretty sure, was a philosophy module because it never linked to medical settings at all. It was just philosophical, which I found really hard in the beginning because I've never done philosophy, but you kind of get really into it, but it was heavy. But the exam question that I chose was basically looking at the moral permissibility of sex and sexual intercourse, which, bloody hell, I remember writing this over about a 9-10 hour period, and it was a traumatic time, as you guys probably saw in my exam diaries. I think I filmed it. Essentially for that question I looked at like Catholic teachings and like philosophy of Catholicism, which basically says that the only morally permissible sex is one in order to create offspring, in order to reproduce, and then kind of linked that into the idea of consent. And I just remember not knowing what the heck I was doing writing that essay, and I think when I recall the essay now I still have no idea what I was writing about. But yeah, essentially I looked at saying like a lot of literature surrounding sex and consensual sex and the morality of it basically says that the only consensual sex is between a man and a woman when they're married and for reproduction, and obviously that's not done in practice. And when you kind of look at that through different lenses, so like homosexuality and like having sex when you're not married, that's still consensual sex and it's still morally permissible. So it'd be absurd to think that like you can only have consensual sex in a marriage. Like that, the moral permissibility of consensual sex generally is very broad. If that makes any sense to you, that's what I wrote. Then the next essays I submitted were a 24-hour exam, but it was 2 essays in the exam, and this was for my medical law module, compulsory module that I had to take, and it was traumatic. It basically recapped the medical law and mental health module that I did in my undergrad. So it was quite easy, but it was just very dull. So basically we looked at like best interest tests and like children and adolescents, and then eating disorders and all the legality of that basically. Medical law was solely a law module, which I kind of liked. There was a few modules I took that were pure law modules, and you could just kind of like, you don't have to worry about the fluff of ethics. You can just be like, this is the law, this is why it's wrong. Kind of like that. The first essay question I did, I'll put it here, but basically it was looking at post-Aintree, which is a big case within medical law, looking at, is Section 4 of the Mental Capacity Act still considered to be the best interest test? So the best interest test looks at like what is in the patient's best interest when they don't have capacity to make their own decisions. So you look at considering their wishes and feelings, what their family might say, if they've pre-stated any wishes, and generally like it favours survival and it's very paternalistic. That's essentially the legal test. That question was really about unpacking Aintree, the legal case, and a few cases since then have broadened the definition beyond what the statute says to include other things, and really arguably changed the scope of what it means to include wishes and feelings and things like that. So it's basically saying, is Section 4 still the test, or do we include the other case law? I argued that we include the other case law, and it makes the test a lot broader because obviously Aintree was a Supreme Court case here, which sets precedent. So when you incorporate that, all the case law as well as the statute test, as well as the code of practice, which isn't legally binding but should be considered against just following what it says in the statute, you'll get kind of two different outcomes depending on what the situation is, and therefore you can't just say that Section 4 is the test. So that was my first question. The second question, I chose two that were relatively similar because then you can use the same body of research, making it a lot easier, because I had to write two 1,200 word essays within 24 hours. The questions were unseen, so you can imagine the trauma that was. I wanted to basically use the same research because then it would make it easier. I think I did both questions in the end in about 18 hours, which isn't too bad. So question 2 was looking at, in order to have capacity, you have to do a 4-prong criteria. I'll put it here. One of those is to weigh information. And weighing information really is very broad. It can literally just be like, I've considered that and I reject it, or it can be really like pro and con list. And the essay was looking at whether somebody's wishes and feelings basically prohibit them from truly weighing the information. For example, if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you strongly believe against blood transfusions, when a doctor then says, okay, you need to have a blood transfusion, what do you think about that? Make the decision. And you just say, nope, don't want it because of that belief. It raises the question of, have you actually considered the information? Because obviously you will die if you don't have it. Or should somebody be allowed to just say, I don't want to have something, it is my belief to have it, therefore I'm not even going to assess the consequence of not having it because I strongly believe something. That was the essay. I argued that basically wishes and feelings don't impact weighing decision, but they do kind of in certain situations, which I feel like is every law essay, where it's sort of like, oh, but it does, but it doesn't, but it depends. I basically said that like in terms of Jehovah's Witnesses and things like that, they do weigh up that information, but they decide with their belief. Whereas in the situations where somebody's beliefs or from his wishes and feelings is a mental illness, they don't truly believe that. It's clouded, and that's kind of happens in a lot of the anorexia cases where somebody rejects like food. Their anorexia or their eating disorder isn't a wish and feelings, so therefore they can't weigh up the information because of mental illness. That's what the law says. That's kind of what I argued. The next two essays were for law modules as well. So the first one I did was for my abortion law module. Most interesting module I've studied. Abortion law is something that has always been very topical, but it's something that I didn't really have much knowledge on, so it was very interesting to learn the law on that, look at some of the ethical issues as well, and just generally understand why the law is the way it is. Because fun fact, a lot of people like in England and Wales think that abortion is legal. Technically it's not legal. It's actually illegal to get an abortion here, but there's just defences in law that make the act basically that you can't prosecute against it. So it's like a full defence in law, which I thought was interesting because you kind of naively go into that module thinking, we can have abortion here, it's legalised. It's not. That was fun to learn on the first day. Anyway, but the essay I did, I first picked one that looked at the interest between a woman and a fetus and like whose interest prevails in the abortion law. I thought that would be really easy. It turns out it was really bloody hard. I researched for 4 days to then scrap the whole thing and write a new essay. So the new essay was Section 11D of the Abortion Act is too vague and is causing doctor and patient uncertainty. So Section 11D is the fetal abnormality ground. I'll put sort of the law here on screen if you want to read it. And it says that abortions can be conducted up to basically birth if there is a serious like possibility that the fetus will have a serious abnormality or defect, which means, you know, you can get an abortion for a child like a week before it's meant to be born and it's in full term because it has something quite minor like, you know, Down syndrome or whatever. There's a lot of case law that was like kicking up a stink about it when somebody was perceived to have an abortion very late on in their pregnancy for a cleft palate, which is obviously very minor, but when you actually read the case, there's a lot of other reasons involved other than that. It was essentially that in a lot of cases of people who have cleft palates, they have other disabilities, and it's for the other disabilities that the abortion was conducted. But the essay itself was really interesting. I argued that yes, it is too vague. It doesn't really say anything there. It needs to be clarified. There's a lot of literature in actual Hansard and as well as code of practices that say, yo, this needs to be updated. But I've also said that it doesn't cause uncertainty for the doctors and the patients, primarily because the doctors have the code of practice, which goes into more detail. There's a lot of literature out there which they can use, but it's basically published by the GMC, General Medical Council, and like the Royal Obstetricians and Gynecologists Society, or whatever it's called. They have a lot of guidance for doctors, so they know when to conduct abortions, although a lot of doctors kind of get a bit funny about it because they don't want to be sued. So there's not uncertainty there, there's more just like fear, I guess is the way to put it. And in terms of patients, I don't really think patients feel any uncertainty around whether they could get an abortion for a fetal abnormality. I think in practice, the way it works a lot of the time is you go in for a scan, then the doctors will say, it's got a fetal abnormality, do you want to get an abortion or not? You weigh it up, you make that decision, and at the same time the doctor should explain to you, okay, this is available, the abortion is available until the end of your pregnancy, till you give birth, and therefore the parents can decide. Basically, if the doctors do their job properly, there's no patient uncertainty. That's what I argued. The next essay I did was for my assisted reproductive law module. Also a really interesting module, looked at PGD, looked at gene editing, which is my specialist area, and looked at IVF. Super interesting. We also looked on a bit of the ethical issues as well, which I liked in the law modules because in the ethics modules you solely just look at the ethics. So in the law modules they do sort of look at some of the ethical concerns because a lot of the time they have underpinned the law. So for this essay, this is one of my favourite essays I think to write. It was so interesting, loads of great literature out there, really big debate, super easy to write. Basically, that was why it was my favourite essay. The essay looked at, should parents, and I love a should question because it makes it easier to think about, should parents who have donor-conceived children tell their children that they're donor-conceived? I argue that yes, they have a moral duty to do so. They don't have a legal duty to do so, but the law should change in order to enforce legal duty. There's so much interesting literature out there in terms of like the psychology discipline as well as, you know, ethical disciplines that state it's very harmful for somebody who is donor-conceived, i.e. somebody who is either the genetic material of one parent or neither parents, to basically know whether their parents are genetically their parents. Also, it's important when the child gets older because, you know, for a lot of medical issues and things like that. Also, there's a big risk, and this is a big thing in the literature, which I talked about quite a bit, is that it's like arguing that the child should know they're donor conceived in case they conduct incest with somebody who basically share the same genetic material as them, because it could happen. Apparently it's a thing, it could happen. You think it's super rare, but apparently children who are donor conceived are more common than you think. I basically argued that parents have a moral duty to disclose to their children that they're donor conceived, to build trust, promote like better mental health, and basically combat a lot of psychological issues as well as combat incest and like a lot of medical health issues. That's the essay. The final essay that I'm writing, and I'm actually writing it like now, is my justice essay. So I will actually vlog this little essay. It'll probably come out next month, like, so you'll see whether what I say I'm going to argue is what I actually argue. But it basically is for my justice module. It's justice and resource allocation. Super interesting module. Had that back in first term. It's just the assessment is now. And it basically looked at philosophical theories that I touched on in my undergrad, so like utilitarianism, consequentialism, deontology, as well as prioritarianism, a lot of isms, and how they relate to the NHS structure, funding, who should get what, how that works, and balance societal inequality. Super interesting module, especially when you look at COVID, when there was no beds and people didn't have ventilators, and how you decided basically who gets what. Interesting and like so current to get our teeth stuck into. My question is here, and it basically is looking at a moral dilemma of there are two patients, one's more in pain than the other, who should get the moral grab on any treatment that's available. I want to write it in terms of prioritarianism and utilitarianism. Utilitarianism basically says it's for the greater good. Prioritarianism basically is a bit different. It's obviously based on a priority scale, and a lot of prioritarianism in practice is like imagining there's a line. So if everybody is above that line in terms of health, so people are super healthy here and people have maybe minor health conditions here, you have the line, and everybody below that is like super ill, then prioritarianism says that all the treatment should go to the super ill people to bring them above the line. Then essentially, obviously, once everybody gets above that line, the line will then move. So the people who were once above the line will then be below the line, and it goes on so forth. But it also, the flaws to that theory is that if the line is here and people have a health condition here and a health condition here, somebody here might still be really, not in a great place as well as the person here, but it's just that they will never get treatment, but these ones will. So it's for interesting ethical theory. I'm basically going to use those two and look at which theory should sort of prevail in that setting. I might, because I don't know about the word count, just pick one of those theories and run with it. I'm not sure yet, but those are the two theories I'm looking at. I might play them off against each other or just pick the one. And that's my justice essay. On top of that, I'm doing a 60 credit dissertation that you guys can follow in my dissertation diaries that I'll be putting out over the summer. And my dissertation is 15,000 words on reproductive gene editing and looking at the legal and ethical consequences. Super interesting. I say that sarcastically. No, it is super interesting. It's my area of specialism. I did my undergrad dissertation on it. If you want to check out my undergrad dissertation diaries, and I did a video basically explaining my full dissertation, then I'll put it like here and also in the description. So yeah, that's pretty much all the essays that I have done throughout my masters. If you want any more information about the essays I did, about any tips for how I researched them or anything like that, please let me know in the comments. I will see you guys in the next video. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.